how do you differentiate for folks the difference between shame and guilt? Because for many people, when you show up at the bridge, there's a component of something that you've done that's wrong, right? You've hurt people along the way. Again, that's, I think, part of the hitting rock bottom that gets you there. It's not just that you've hurt yourself. You've probably injured others now. And that's a part of this maladaptive behavior that's now kind of spiraling out of just being adaptive. So how do you talk about the difference between guilt and shame, and how do you work somebody out of that?
Well, guilt's about making a mistake. Shame's about being a mistake, right? You know, guilt. I did something. I made a mistake. I did something that I wish I hadn't have done. I need to make an apology, right? And there's a way back from that. I'm thinking of this classic John Bradshaw when he's talking about healthy shame versus toxic shame. And when you talk about a difference between guilt and shame, we're talking about toxic shame, right? That there's something flawed, this flawed, defective core, if you will. My identity is, there's something wrong with me, right? There's a way back from the guilt. Shame registers so differently. So when we talk about folks being wounded and the shame, and that's how the shame gets registered, somebody once told me that my father never had to get sober because he had me and my mother and my sister to carry a shame for him. Okay, so it can be a generational thing, and it comes from somewhere else. But shame can play out two different ways. Some of us, when we're living from our shame, we live out of superiority, right? So
grandiose shame.
Grandiosity. I control, I perfect, I judge, I criticize. Out of my woundedness, out of my shame, that can be the me that you see on the outside. And some folks, the other side of that coin, of course, is inferiority, right? Broken, worthless, you know. I am my pathology.
Why do you think one chooses preferentially one of those? I mean, I know that my tendency is always more towards grandiosity than inferiority. What do you think it is in some individuals that steers them one way or the other when they're in that? And by the way, I love that these are, I don't even say this to be judgmental. I just think that this is a really interesting way to observe. But I know that when my inner monologue becomes more judgmental, that's a great yellow light for me, right? It's like, oh, look at the judgy words, you're using. Look at the black and white thinking that permeates every statement that you're making. But again, that tends to be the gravitational pull. Why do you think certain people have that?
That thing you just said is the thing, though, that I can't not hold focus on. Like that little conversation that you just had with self. Now, you've done the work. You're still doing the work. I'm looking at the journal sitting in front of me. That's just a portion of the work, right? But having that voice that you've obviously cultivated, that's where the hope is. Because again, to live in simplicity, I say I hate to oversimplify, but I don't. At the end of the day, I got bad news for the folks out there who think that there's going to come a time through my healing that I just never get triggered again. Especially those of us who have experienced trauma. Bad news, you will be triggered again. And this whole integration game is about starting to live a life where I tell stories that go like this. I noticed that I was starting to be really judgmental. I noticed I was getting triggered. I had this little short, subtle thought, conversation, whatever that looked like. Maybe there was something somatic that happened with my body that I did, but I had this thing that I cultivated, this new muscle that gave me enough space to choose my next step. When so many of us, especially out of our shame, out of our trauma, have lived a life telling so many stories that go like this. I got triggered and then I did this, right? And that's the reaction versus the response. Simple goal, right? Complex process.